Shelfad, MS 5114, British Library, London. Right now, tonight, while you sleep, 23 quires of Coptic papyrus, bound in a single volume, sitting in a climate-controlled repository that requires institutional credentials and a formal written request to access. Acquired in 1785 from the estate of Dr. Anthony Askew, it contains the most complete procedural account of soul transit ever committed to writing. Not mythology, not metaphor, a document. And the Church never wanted it read aloud. Suppressed, reframed, declared heretical. In 325 CE, the Council of Nicaea made decisions about which texts would shape Christianity and which would disappear. The Pistis Sophia disappeared. For roughly 1400 years, it existed outside the reach of ordinary readers, copied by a small number of hands, hidden in collections that most people never knew existed. Then, 1773 arrived. A manuscript surfaces in London. One private sale changes everything. 14 centuries of silence, broken by a single transaction. The text itself is called Pistis Sophia. In Coptic, that translates directly as faithful wisdom. Not a parable, not a vision. A recorded dialogue. Jesus speaking to his disciples after the resurrection, describing in precise procedural language exactly where souls go after the body dies. The destinations are named. The mechanisms are named. The officials who process each soul are named. In the next several minutes, you will see what the text says about soul escorts and judgment courts, what the manuscript describes as the actual architecture of the afterlife, and why what it reveals stands in direct contradiction to everything institutional Christianity has taught for 1700 years. If forbidden biblical history is what keeps you up at night, subscribe now. Every week we unseal what was removed. The British Library holds ad MS 5114. The text inside is a Coptic translation of a Greek original, and the standard English rendering remains the 1896 translation by G.R.S. Mead, cross-referenced against the Carl Schmidt Critical Edition of 1905. In the second book of this manuscript, the text makes a claim that should be impossible. It states that when a soul exits the body at death, it does not travel alone. Two companions leave with it. The first is what the Coptic calls the eidolon, the image, a kind of residual energetic impression of the life just lived. The second is something far stranger. The Coptic term is antimemon pneuma. Break that down. Antimemon means counterfeit, imitative, a copy made to shadow the original. Pneuma means spirit, the counterfeit spirit. Not a guide in any comforting sense. An archon-built construct, a symbol at the moment of birth, designed to attach itself to the soul and record everything. Every action, every intention, every moral weight carried across an entire lifetime. This is not decoration. The text is precise about function. The antimemon pneuma is a recorder and an escort simultaneously. It accompanies the soul from the moment of physical death and does not release it until the soul has been delivered to a specific location for evaluation. The text names that location. We will get there, but first, understand what this mechanism implies. The soul does not drift. It does not float freely into some ambient light. It is collected, escorted, accompanied by a record of itself that it cannot alter, cannot negotiate, cannot charm. The antimemon pneuma knows everything. It was there for all of it. Now, here is where the manuscript crosses into territory that no ancient author should have been able to reach. Modern near-death experience research has documented, across more than 280 independently collected cases, a phenomenon researchers call the life review. Dr. Raymond Moody first cataloged it in 1975. Dr. Kenneth Ring expanded the clinical literature through the 1980s and 1990s. The International Association for Near-Death Studies has since compiled case studies spanning 6 decades and multiple cultures. The consistent report is this: at the moment of clinical death, the subject experiences a panoramic, instantaneous replay of their entire life. Not a highlight reel. Every moment. Weighted. Felt from the perspective of everyone they affected. A complete moral accounting. Experienced rather than observed. The clinical literature calls it the life review mechanism. The Pistis Sophia calls it the antimimo pneuma delivering its record. Same mechanism, same function. One described in a Coptic manuscript assembled no later than the 3rd century CE. One documented in peer-reviewed literature beginning in 1975. The text named this process approximately 1,700 years before the first clinical case study was written. That is not coincidence. That is not allegory finding accidental overlap with science. That is a document describing a real process in real terms using real structural language at a moment in history when no framework existed to fabricate it convincingly. The ancients did not have the vocabulary of clinical death research. They had something else: direct testimony. The antimimo pneuma collects the soul. The eidolon carries the image of the life, and together they escort what remains of you toward a court. And what happens inside that court is where everything the church taught about judgment begins to collapse. The Pistis Sophia's 4th book, housed in the British Library as Codex Ascuianus, catalogued under Additional Manuscript 5114, translated by G.R.S. Mead in 1921, and re-examined by Violet McDermott for Brill in 1978, describes a figure called the Virgin of Light. Not a metaphor, not a symbolic archetype, a named functionary in a cosmic administrative structure assigned one specific task. She reads the seal. The Coptic term is sphragus. It translates directly as seal, but not a wax imprint, not a stamp. In the context of this text, the sphragus is an encoded record. It contains every mystery the soul received during its time in a body, every initiation, every fragment of direct knowledge of the divine, the entire spiritual biography of a human being, compressed into a single readable mark that the Virgin of Light can examine in the moment of death. She doesn't weigh the heart. She doesn't consult a ledger. She reads the seal. And the reading is instantaneous. Now here is where this becomes impossible to dismiss. The idea of a post-mortem record that encodes the total content of a soul's experiential knowledge, not its moral behavior, not its ritual compliance, but specifically its gnosis, its direct experiential understanding. That concept had no parallel in any mainstream theological tradition of the ancient world. Egyptian judgment weighed moral conduct. Hebrew tradition focused on covenant fidelity. Roman religious thought barely addressed the soul's mechanics at all. Yet this text, sealed inside a Coptic manuscript that never circulated beyond a small initiated community, describes something that looks less like theology and more like a data retrieval system. He had no framework to invent this from. It wasn't available. And what happens when the seal is empty? The text is precise. A soul that carries no gnosis in the seal cannot pass. It is not condemned. It is not damned in the sense that any mainstream tradition uses that word. It is turned back, returned. The Virgin of Light hands it to the receivers of wrath, named functionaries, not demons, not punishers, whose role is specifically to carry unqualified souls toward what the text calls the outer darkness zones. The receivers of wrath. That title sounds like punishment. But read the Coptic function more carefully. They are receivers. They transport. They carry. They are not torturers. They are administrators of a sorting system. The text never describes them inflicting pain. It describes them delivering souls to appropriate locations based on the diagnostic reading the Virgin of Light just performed. This is not a judgment court built on divine anger. It is a triage center.
Before we continue, some of what I've learned simply never makes it onto YouTube. That's why I started the Gnostic newsletter, a free newsletter where I go deeper into esoteric Gnostic teachings, hidden wisdom, and the mysteries we don't share in these videos. And when you sign up, you'll receive a Gnostic guide to mastering reality as a welcome gift, completely free. You'll find it through the link in the description below or by scanning the QR code on your screen. I'll give you a moment to do that.
Built on precision, the Virgin of Light reads what the soul contains. The soul either passes or it doesn't. If it doesn't, it is routed. The routing is not arbitrary. It is calibrated to exactly what the seal revealed about what that soul is missing. Modern neuroscience has spent decades mapping what it calls memory consolidation, the process by which experience is encoded into retrievable biological structure. The language is different, the substrate is different, but the underlying architecture is identical. Experience leaves a readable trace. The quality of that trace determines what the system does next. A soul with no encoded light gets routed to a correction space. A brain with no consolidated memory gets routed to rehabilitation. The ancients called it the sphragus. We call it engram architecture. Same phenomenon, 17 centuries apart. And here is where the text stops being a spiritual comfort and becomes something colder. The Virgin of Light's court is not the end of the process. It is the beginning. She reads the seal, she makes the determination, and then the soul is handed off. And what waits at the end of that handoff is described in the Pistis Sophia with a specificity that no one who reads it carefully ever forgets. The Pistis Sophia's second book, Codex Esquivianus, Additional Manuscript 5114, British Library, translated by Charlotte Baines in 1933, and cross-referenced by Mead's critical apparatus, names them directly. 12 dungeons of outer darkness. Not one undifferentiated void. Not a single lake of fire. 12 distinct containment spaces, each assigned a presiding ruler, each calibrated to receive a specific type of soul. The Coptic term used is amente. Translators have reached for the word hell, because that is the nearest English container. But amente does not mean hell in the sense that 17 centuries of Christian preaching have defined it. Amente means the hidden place, the place below, a temporary space of containment and correction. The root carries no concept of permanence, no concept of eternal duration. It is a bounded location with a function, and the function is not punishment, it is processing. This is the impossible knowledge beat. Every mainstream theological tradition that described a post-mortem punishment space in the ancient world described it as either eternal or indeterminate in duration. Zoroastrian tradition placed souls in a bridge judgment, but offered no structured containment architecture. Greek Tartarus was vague in its mechanics. Roman Avernus was largely poetic. Yet this text, buried for centuries, describes 12 named dungeons, each with a presiding ruler, each calibrated to match the specific composition of the soul entering it. Not the same space for every unqualified soul. Matched spaces. Diagnostic placement. The soul's composition determines which dungeon receives it. The dungeon's specific environment then acts on that composition. Duration is finite. The text is explicit on this point. The soul remains in the dungeon until its debt. The Coptic uses a term closer to imbalance or deficiency, is dissolved. When the dissolution is complete, the dungeon releases the soul, not into reward, not into the treasury of light, into the reincarnation cycle, back into a body, back into an opportunity to fill the seal. Pause on the architecture of that for a moment. This is not a system built on divine retribution. There is no rage in this design. There is no eternal exclusion. There is a deficiency, a corrective space calibrated to that deficiency, a finite duration measured against the magnitude of the deficiency, and then an exit. The exit leads somewhere specific, and where it leads changes everything you were told about what the church believed before the councils rewrote the record. The century bridge is not subtle here. Modern correctional theory, specifically the rehabilitative model developed through the 20th century, formalized in the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, adopted in 1955, describes exactly this architecture. Containment, calibrated to the individual. Duration, proportional to the corrective need. Structured exit back into society. Hell, as the Pistis Sophia describes it, is not a destination. It is a processing chamber with a measured, calibrated, procedurally governed exit. He had no UN charter. He had no criminological theory. He had no rehabilitation framework. Yet the text he transmitted describes a post-mortem correction system that matches that framework in every structural detail. And what the text says happens after the processing, after the dungeon releases the soul, after the imbalance is dissolved, will dismantle the last assumption you are carrying into this video. The Pistis Sophia's first book, same manuscript, same custodian, same Coptic hand, describes the destination for souls who pass the Virgin of Light's court. The risen Jesus names it directly in testimony delivered to his disciples over 11 years of post-resurrection teaching. 11 years the canonical Gospels never mention. 11 years the church councils excised entirely. He calls it the treasury of light. The Coptic is thesaurus, Greek loanword absorbed into Coptic usage, and the meaning is precise. A storehouse, a repository, a specific location where things of value are held in their complete and permanent form. The text does not use this word metaphorically. It uses it architecturally. The treasury of light is described as the pleroma's reception chamber, the outermost interior of the divine fullness, the place where souls bearing the complete mysteries of light arrive and do not leave. No recycling, no return, no reincarnation. The soul that carries a full sphragis passes directly into the treasury of light and remains. Now here is the impossible knowledge beat that should stop you completely. The concept of a discrete cosmic reception chamber, a bounded location at the edge of the divine fullness that functions as a permanent repository for qualified souls, has no parallel in any canonical text, any mainstream theological tradition, any mystical school that operated openly in the ancient world. Platonic thought described the soul's return to the One, but as dissolution, not storage. Neoplatonism described emanation and return, but never named a specific reception location with administrative function. Yet this text names it, describes its function, and assigns it a specific role in a larger system that includes the judgment court, the outer darkness, and the reincarnation gate, all interlocking, all procedurally coherent. And then the text names the administrator of reincarnation, Io, the first man. His role is specific. Souls released from the outer darkness dungeons, souls whose seals remain incomplete after the correction cycle, are brought before Io. He seals them into new bodies, not as a reward, not as a spiritual evolution, as an administrative reset. The soul returns to the material world with another opportunity to receive the mysteries of light, to fill the sphragis, to eventually qualify for the treasury. The century bridge here is quantum information theory. In 2014, physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff published updated work on their orchestrated objective reduction model, proposing that consciousness is not generated by the brain, but processed through it, and that quantum information encoded in microtubule structures may be preserved at the Planck scale after biological death. Not destroyed, preserved, potentially reinstantiated. The ancients called it reincarnation administered by EO. Penrose and Hameroff call it quantum information persistence. Same structural claim. 17 centuries of distance between them. But here is what makes this the most disturbing detail in the entire manuscript. The risen Jesus taught this system: the judgment court, the 12 dungeons, the treasury, the reincarnation gate, over 11 continuous years of post-resurrection instruction. The disciples recorded it, the Coptic scribes copied it, and then the institutional church across the councils of the 3rd and 4th centuries made a decision. Every word of it was removed. Not lost, not forgotten, removed. And what that removal was designed to prevent you from understanding is exactly what the map, still sitting in the British Library right now, is still waiting to show you. Add MS 5114. That is the shelf mark. It sits in the British Library right now. GRS Mead's 1896 translation is publicly available, unredacted, today. You can read every word of the transit system, the judgment courts, the calibrated darkness, the reincarnation gate. Every word. The mechanism described in that codex is not presented as history. It is presented as operational. Running. Now. You carry a divine spark. The map tells you precisely where it goes, what weighs it, and what escorts it forward. That codex has been sitting there for centuries. Waiting. Checkable. Open. If this map changes how you understand your own soul, say so below. Every week, another sealed text surfaces here. Subscribe.